Hey guys, this is Chris from DSX Machina, and the fit for today is Deadpool, and we are talking about Amethyst Revelations, which comes out this week, hopefully around Thursday. We're going to go through the content, we're going to go through the book, and talk about what is included, and hopefully do so in less than 2 hours, because I did this video already, and it was like 2 hours long, and I realized I rambled for too much, so I'm literally doing the whole thing over again. So, here's the cover, and there's actually an image that's been deleted here, and that's to prevent the page spread from being inconsistent. So here's our contents. The image behind here is Dracontia, and I'm not really concealing it. You're going to see this image again later on. I really liked it here just because you can really see the scale of how big the Kingdom of Dragons is. You can also see the book. It goes up to 439 pages around there. It is a big book. It is the biggest that we have ever made. I think Amethyst Factions is second place, but this is definitely first. And chapter 1 is kind of a recap. I can't feel it's important to do at least a basic recap, but then we kind of move into the new content. One of the things I did in Affinity was whenever I had these little excerpts that they would conceal illustrations so that these are very much tapped on. And I didn't do that for the first two Amethysts, but I'm doing it for this one because I think it's a neat touch. And all the illustrations are just illustrations from the other books, so you're not missing anything. So another thing that we did is that whenever it's an excerpt from a fantasy book, it's paper. If it's an excerpt from a Tekken's source, like an actual digital archive, it'll be blue. So that's another thing I kind of set in motion here. It's a very quick chapter. Chapter 2 moves on to races. Obviously, all the other races previously. This is a Windweaver. They are desert dwellers. This is a Gimfen. The ear is not 100% right, but it's close enough. This is more like a Damascan ear, but whatever. This is very, very good, very close, accurate Chaperon. Very similar to the Ashu Bushmen from Factions. So much so that the spear, I think, is exactly the same. But these are the Asilitanga, and then we have Dust Drifter. So all the fantasy creatures from the first books always make a reappearance. We talk about the new variations and the new offshoots. So like in real life, certain groups of people, regardless of their genetic origin, will be very different depending on where they're raised. And an example is the Asilitanga compared to the Dust Drifters. And these are both Chaperons, but one are desert dwellers and the other ones are kind of savanna dwellers. And Damascans, we finally get Demacia, which is the original home kingdom of the Damascans, closely related to their original origins, not influenced by the humans, which created Limshao. So we have a bit more what Damascans look like, more looser clothing, less of the kind of tight leather, which is the custodian that's being concealed by this illustration right here. Gimfen, we mentioned Tinkertops and Windweavers. Tinkertops are more, they can be technologically orientated or they can be fantasy orientated, but they're definitely more cliched. The Windweavers, as I talked about, are part of the Drift. The Drift is a sand sea. A good chunk of Africa is this ocean of sand. It operates like water. You've seen it numerous times in certain video games, certain ideas having sand look like water and so forth. It was very much inspired by an anime called Green Legend Ran, and a lot of I took some screenshots from it and sent it to Nick as part of the inspiration to get the technology the way we wanted it to look. Ladinians don't change much. We do have one variation, that's Silverian. And then Neros, once again, very militaristic, very non-dwarf-like. And so we have Karnak of the Shield, which are these very militaristic, much more fanatical warrior Neros that run this giant fortification that seals the east and west of Asia. Pegasus, there's two types of Pegasus. We have the Pegasus that are basically enslaved, like most of them are. Then we have more free Pegasus, which are the Caledonians, which live in Scotland. This guy's supposed to have more of a kilt. I think it comes off, but no, he's supposed to have a kilt. I love the idea of a Pegasus with a kilt. The Tenebrae, of course, being away from Vakai, the Tenebrae are much more the way they're supposed to act compared to the cognitive dissonance that they suffer from in Vakai. So we have the Serenos, Tenebrae, and they have their own little culture, and we talk about the Serenos later in the book, but there's them. The Thailand, we have the Thailand rules, there's a Thailand illustration, and they have their version, the Argentari. We get to new species. I originally had Degus, because I have Degus, which you can kind of hear, Digit and Gizmo, and they're adorable and they're lovely. But I was going to have a Degu race, and I found out that they're not native to anywhere in this book. So I went to voles, and unfortunately some of the ideas we had to throw out. So they're basically voles, and because they're voles, they have a very short lifespan. They're very good burrowers. They can jump, and within the setting, they're very adept magically. So despite having a short lifespan, they pick up magic quite easily, and their nations are very cliched fantasy. So there are paladins, and then there are fighters, and then there are rogues. And so we have two illustrations of them, and one is of a knight, and the other one's a spellcaster. Vispids came out of an idea of simply having a very small creature that was very, very strong. And so a Vispid are tiny creatures. This is one of the few times where a player character can play a tiny character, but their ability modifiers are strength. So you can see they get a +3 to strength, max 20. Their dexterity goes up by 1. Their constitution goes down just because it has to. Yeah, I need some balance in there. But that's the idea there. They are extremely strong, but they're very tiny. Within the lore, Shapira and Anathema are almost all female. And as a result of that, most Vispids are female. So in order for them to reproduce, they can assume a medium form for a short period of time. And then after that, most of the time they are in this form. But we can become medium for a period of time, and then go back. And then as one of the feats, you can also give them wings. Renero, or my sea elves, these are very much related to Atlantis, the Lost Kingdom, the very kind of underappreciated Disney film. They are sea elves, and they don't really use technology, but they make their magic look like technology. So they have vehicles that are enchanted. They have a whole bunch of golems that are enchanted, but they kind of look like machines, but they're not, because they enchant these statues, and their entire underwater empire is guarded and controlled and basically run off of these magical creations that they've made. And I was thinking of including rules of how a player character can have their own golems and have their golem vehicles that they can ride. And at 440 pages, we simply ran out of space. Same thing goes with the drift technology. For example, there were going to be some rules about creating magical vehicles and so forth, and that got unfortunately pushed aside. And that's the end of this chapter. We're going into Renero, and there's some feats and so forth. But yeah, you want to be a sea elf? We have that now. Going into chapter 3, backgrounds. This is one of the later images Nick did. I like how Ryan Reynolds shows up. I'm joking. Obviously, that's not Ryan Reynolds, but I always make a joke that it looks like Ryan Reynolds. And we have a lot of ones here, and these are all very regionally based within Europe or Africa, which are the two continents that we focus on. And I don't really go much into detail. We have Bastionborn, and go to Bastionborn, and then Damascus. This image is very much based off of the cover image from Factions. I think her ear might be a bit too big. That's closer to a Tenebrae ear. And Dust Devils, Hapura Inkweavers. We've actually had people, some bands have actually messaged me and goes, hey, when it comes to the totem sigils, you have to have your totem always on your hand at any one time. Can't you tattoo them onto your body? And I said, yes, you can, but no one knows how to do it and make it work except for one specific city. And that city is called Hapura, and so I finally have the rules. So this is not me bending to pressure to offer the idea of a tattooed spellcaster. It was always coming, and now it's here. And we'll see an image of them in a bit. Luminaria Tunneler, that's if you want to play a Vol. There was the adventure Fistful of Dragons, which we published, is set in a town called Mayasto, and Mayasto finally shows up in the setting. And Naros Ronin, Maghrebi Nomad, which is part of the Sandsea. Runeo Explorer, CFS Guardian, if you want to be a Vispid. There's another Vispid. There's 3 Vispids. And the Volar Knight of Luminaria. And there's our little, our adorable little Volar Knight, which is, I think, very cute. Anyway, we end on this image here, which is Porto. We'll see this image again later. So we're talking about classes. There are 5 classes that we introduce. This was more about me trying to create canonically accurate martial classes that are based off of the fantasy classes in 5e. So the Charlatan is a merging of the Bard and the Rogue, but we've taken away the Assassin rules and we've taken away the Bard's magic. So he's got 3 paths. They can be the Artist, which is more performance, the Bard's singing, the Personality, which is the leadership abilities the Bard has, and then the Robber, which are the thieving abilities the Rogue has. And so this is the Charlatan. A lot of customization for the career path, for example. For every one of these you take, one of these gets locked off. So even though you can customize it, you don't have free reign to pick up whatever you want. For example, if you pick Mimicry, you can't pick up Uncanny, for example. So that is that. And then we go on to Equestrian. Equestrian is a paladin fighter without magic. So we take the paladin, take away all the magical aspects of paladin, add in a bunch of the cavalier stuff. So you get a mount bond, you get to do stuff with your mount. Heavily on that. So there's some paladin stuff in here. Oh, there's a line there I have to fix. But there's no magical abilities. There's no turning undead like a cleric, and you can't lay on hands or anything like that. The Maverick is the Ranger. We've taken out the animal bond, and we've taken out the magic, and we've added in all of the non-burglar abilities of the Rogue. So we've added the Assassin, and we've added the Ranger, so you're a real guerrilla fighter. In fact, you actually have several different abilities you can start off with. One of them is called Guerrilla, and then we have Dual Wielding, which is very Ranger-like, Toxphilite, which is your archery, and Cutthroat, which is more an assassin. And you have the sneak attack ability called Assassin right here. So this is a version of a non-magical Ranger with rogue sneak attack. Striker, which is a barbarian / fighter. And the way your class operates is based heavily off of where your ability scores are at. So as you start your character and as you develop, you get different abilities. Then a bunch of exploits to customize your character. And then we finally have the Pleromancer. The Pleromancer is a very bizarre spellcaster. We'll go into details in it with the next chapter. The Pleromancer is about using your totem to create living spells. And you do exactly that. You create what is effectively elementals. Every spell you cast is a living being, is an elemental made out of some elements that you've customized. You've implanted spells and spell-like effects in that creature to make it more powerful, to do certain things. And then it acts from your prerogative, but it acts very much independently. And there's that Tapura Inkweaver right there. And that's it. We'll go on to... Oh, and then we go into archetypes. We talk about the Tekken archetypes that work with our new classes, as well as all the other classes that also function. And then we've also reprinted a bunch of other archetypes that were compatible with the 5e spellcasters, and we've redone them here so they're compatible with our Pleromancer. And then we've added a whole bunch of new ones as well. Ekken Kensai, Cut Purse, Espar Agent, and some other ones here. Sailor, and then we have the Meyer Paladins. Meyer Paladins might have been mentioned a bit. They're a very egotistical and arrogant, fanatical, religious sect of fighters that believe that only they should use magic, and all magic items should be cloistered and locked up under their control. We'll see them at length in the setting section. Sand Shaper is part of the Drift. Salvatera is a Tekken one. School of Nilomancy, a lot of stuff on that. And I think, and then Mage, and then we move on to Magic. So the Magic rules, as mentioned, you are custom creating elemental creatures. They're called sprouts. There's two versions of them. You can either have a wisp or an arcanum. A wisp is like a dandelion seed head. It's very small, and all the there are basic spells it can do. A lot of it deals with enchantment. So the wisp will fly into a creature. So if you want to like enchant, sleep, all those effects are the wisp. Anything that's offensive, aggressive, attack types, that's when you implant them into an arcanum. Yeah, the arcanum is a natural elemental creature. So you're basically making your own monster. You create them using ability scores. You choose your element, and that element can be adjusted later. So you're not limited to just earth, water, fire, and so forth. You can combine them with other elements, and there are certain ones that are not compatible with others, which we list here. But you could have an earth radiant one, for example. You could have you could have a fire and lightning. I think, yeah, fire and lightning you can have, and that gives you additional abilities. You basically spell something. You spell points called totem points. And everything has a totem cost. It tells you the cost. These are modifiers because you can't just make an acid elemental. You make like a water elemental and then you turn it into an acid elemental with tier 2. So you're limited to tier 1 when you start your character, and eventually you'll get access to tier 2 and then eventually to tier 3. And yeah, these are the stats that you can create. You get certain movement, your AC, types of attacks, your immunities, special properties which you get for free. And they're all completely modifiable. You can as long as you have totem points, you can basically make this creature do whatever you want. You can give it more hit dice, give it a higher AC. You can make the duration of the creature last longer. Like obviously, you can make it permanent if it's a wisp. Then you give it more vulnerabilities. There's a acid or a necrotic one right there, and fully customizable. And then you get special abilities. And we have some examples. We have an air arcanum and a magma arcanum. There's an image of a wisp. Now you can, and then you can implant ingrafts. So there are actually dozens and dozens of ingrafts. There are ones that are specifically only designed for wisps, and ones that are universal for all of them, and then ones that are specifically bound to very specific elements. And then there you go. And then you implant these, and some of them are like basically very similar to spells that you've seen from 5e, and some of them are very, very, very different. But yeah, and so when you're casting the spell's origin is the creature and not you. So yeah, you can in a way cast a spell and then control that creature, but then you can do something else. You can go off and hide if you want. And then we have a lot of engrafts here. There's another fire one there. There's a fire-based one. And there's a bunch here, so I won't go into huge details. And then rituals operate a little differently than this set of rules here. And there's a whole bunch from there. After that, we go into alchemy. This is, I hate to say it, but I'll admit it, this is basically a copy-pasting from the alchemy rules in Paradise, which is part of the Affinity Trilogy. But I've always stated that there are rules for alchemy in Amethyst. I just never brought them forward. Now I have. So if you don't have Paradise Affinity and you want to make potions, here you go. Potions. After that, we have magic items, and we finally have rules for the Rage of Dagarasu, which is this sword that's been illustrated and mentioned since the first book. We finally have it here. It's one of the 3 eyes. We have one of them was introduced in factions. Here's a second one. And like before, we talk about 2 amethyst artifacts. In this case, we have this shield and the staff. And yeah, there you go. And a bunch of magic items we've added in. I think some of these are also inspired from Paradise. That moves us into technology. This illustration here I want to talk about real quick. This is one of the commissions that you could unlock as a backer level. So this I think is Nigel's image. We can send him a bunch of sketches based on his ideas. This was the finalist, and I added this sketch Nick did to the back of it. So Nick created this image. That's two different sketches. One that was Nigel's image, and one which is a mechanite, even though we don't really detail what a mechanite is for a lot further down in the book. Now, we have a couple new technologies to talk about. We have assembly technology, Harmony, Motigo, Polus, and Porto. Porto, of course, for those people who remember, Porto is the most technologically advanced bastion in the entire setting, or on Earth. You can see technically there is somebody more advanced we'll get into. And their technology is very sensitive to EDF, but they're much more expressive outside of their borders, compared to Motigo, which is almost as technologically advanced as Porto, although they mastered anti-gravity technology, which Porto stole. There's a bit of a story to that. They are religious, similar to Man, but unlike Man, which became xenophobic and locked themselves into their city, Motigo decided to suppress the population around them. Not too dissimilar to what we see with Battle Angel Alita, with Zalem floating over the people below. Motigo does the same thing. Harmony is a very low-tech bastion, so they have a lot of resistance to disruption because they've always had to deal with disruption. Harmony is also giant. It's physically, from a real estate perspective, footprint, it's the largest bastion out there. Assembly is the weird one. Assembly used to be called Aviv, if you ever played the original homebrew game from the early 2000s. And it was inspired by Giger's New York City. And so everything was based off of that. And originally Aviv was just abandoned. Like, no one really knew what happened to the people there, but it's a biomechanical city. It seems to be working, but no one ever sees anyone inside. No one ever comes out, and no one ever leaves. And I decided to toss that out. I wanted more detail. I wanted to have more parable, a real creepy ambience to it. And I found it when I played the video game Scorn. And although Scorn is not a very well-made game, you basically have to read people's headcanons and unofficial lore dumps that you can find around, and some from the game's own art book, to piece an idea what the setting's about. And even then, it's not 100% clear. But I took some of the leads that were implied with the game and created assembly from the DNA from the original bastion of Aviv. So it's bioorganic. When we get to the weapons, these are all weapons pulled from Ultramodern 5 because they were originally weapons for Amethyst. I took out, put them into Ultramodern, and then I took them back out again. So we have the bioorganic weapons here and the super high-tech weapons from Porto also here. So these weapons will look familiar if you have Ultramodern 5. This gun was actually a angel weapon, which is a race that's mentioned at the end of the book, but they use mostly melee weapons, so I brought that illustration over. Shift weapons, bastion-specific weapons, and then we get to armor. There's a lot of armor in this one, folks. A lot, because we talk about the super exo armor, which is stupid. No one should ever have this, but I wanted to because it's awesome. Super heavy exo armor are just like the other exo armors, so they give you a threshold and hit points, and basically it's the equivalent of having armor and 3 or 4 magic items for game balance. The super heavy exo armor is balanced if 3 characters use it, and that's actually fair because the heavy exo armors are so large they can be piloted by multiple people. We'll talk about that once we get to them. This one's image is always, I always figured that this person's helmet is actually raised, like it's supposed to be down the cover of face, and you're just seeing it lifted up. That's the impression I got from that image. So that's Motigo. They're all about being showy. And compared to Porto is also showy, but they're more colorful. So these are 2 very similar designs. This looks more like a heavy armor, but it's a medium one, even though it does operate a bit like a heavy in the fact that, in my opinion, the person's arms are actually in here and their legs go here. So these are not their real arms. That's just what I think. This design was actually from Rongo. It used to be a robot. Now it's a mecha, so maybe a person doesn't fit in there, but whatever. This armor door was a bit plain looking, so I had Nick said, I need this to be more colorful. It's a bit plain, so it's got a lot more color now. Then we get to the super exo armor. So the super exo armor are generally huge, so they're obviously not going to be very functional in dungeons. They have a couple rules. One is that they can have pilots, and the fact is that some of them can have 2 or 3 additional characters. So you can have 4 characters operating in a single mech. And the rule is everyone gets a full turn. So everyone rolls initiative, and then they can move it and use weapons, and then the next person can then move it and use weapons. So it's a suit that everyone gets to use. The big rule is the fact that anyone who uses a set of weapons, those weapons are not available to anyone else. So that's a reason why the heavy armor will have sometimes 4 or 5 different weapons on it, because every character inside has to use their own weapon system. There are other rules. If you have an aura, like you're a marshal, it doesn't radiate outside the mech. And if you're outside the mech, it doesn't radiate inside the mech. So it's very much an isolated system. And there's a bunch of cool weapons you can get, which we'll explain later. They have other rules that are unique to it. Just because of the way the layout works, I couldn't get an illustration properly fitted for each one. So this is a Conquistador, even though the Conquistador is here, and then the Fafnir is here, even though it's this one. It's just... That's why I had to put these little here so you know that. This is the Conquistador. This is the Fafnir. In the case of the Conquistador, it doesn't have a spare pilot, but it does have an AI that operates on another initiative. The Fafnir has 2 pilot seats. This one obviously doesn't have any arms. It's just a weapons platform, and that's what it is. It's just a giant weapons platform. The Jormungandr is just freaking huge. I think this guy should be smaller, actually. This thing is actually supposed to be like gargantuan, isn't it? But no, maybe to me it's still huge. But anyway, it's the biggest one. I will admit, full disclosure, when we first started playing around with the art, I was playing around with generative AI, just trying to get ideas and inspiration. And then I would send these images to Nick, and then he would interpret it in his own idea. And we were doing this for a while, but I don't do it anymore. I canceled my generative subscription services, all of them, over a year ago, so I don't use them. But this was the image I sent to Nick, and it came out because back then, over a year ago, a lot of these generative models weren't very good. You had the problems with the fingers. And when I was trying to have it generate mecha, for one of them, it just gave it a third leg. No reason, just gave it a third leg. And I was just like, that's actually kind of awesome. I think I'm going to give this one a third leg. So Nick, make sure this thing has a third leg. So that's the Jormungandr, which came out of a mistake. So that's the Jormungandr. It's huge. It has 3 pilots, a co-pilot seat, so 4 people can use it. I see the pilot and co-pilot because there's a commander, and the commander can override. So you don't have a situation where 3 characters are constantly playing tug of war. There is a commander that controls the mech that can override a player's action if they're not acting like a team. This is the Panzer. This is another example of I sent Nick an image of that was a real mess. It was just a mess, but it was provided inspiration. I think the only thing he ever took was just this center part of this torso, and everything else he had to redraw from the ground up. So there was originally, I wanted the idea of a 4-legged tank. I have to add an image of a person because it looks like this is supposed to be. It looks way smaller. I don't know, maybe the artist's scale, but there's supposed to be 3 people are supposed to fit in this thing. But this is much more like a walking battle tank, which I really like. Yeah, that's the Panzer, and then we have the Paluda, which looks very much like the Rifleman from Macross, and the Tiamat, which is very much inspired by the Gladiator. I'm trying to remember what the Macross version, because Gladiator I think is the Robotech name for it. But yeah, this one it's the one that has the meaty fists and the gauntlets. This one actually says gauntlets as well, and this one's not supposed to have. Yeah, this one says gauntlets. It's not supposed to have gauntlets. I got to remove that. And then we have a bunch of demigod class weapons, stupidly powerful because they're all huge. So like a Mongol Maul, 6x6 bludgeoning, and then even the laser weapons, 6x6 piercing. They're crazy. They're crazy. When we get to the Assembly Mutalists, once again, definitely inspired by the game Scorn. There are 3 of them: the Carapace, the Craniopagus, and the Parasite. And it wraps around you like this is. I know it doesn't seem like it's wrapping around you, but this is technically armor. This is light armor. It gives you an extra limb, a tail, where it can hold on to stuff. The Craniopagus gives you another set of arms, and the Carapace covers you completely. And these creatures, these armor sets, can actually detach and act on their own. So they become monsters. And these are bonded to you, so they don't operate on their own. You can control them telepathically, even when they're not attached to you. And so, yeah, it becomes its own little monster, which is kind of creepy. Then we get to new vehicles. These are just new ground vehicles. There's actually more vehicles to talk about. Most of these are generally very large because they're designed to operate in Arconia, which is Africa, which is a lot more open space, so vehicles can get a lot larger. The Excalibur, which is kind of like an aircraft carrier conning tower on wheels. That's what that was basically inspired by. The Iron Horse, the land train. Some of this is pulled from Affinity Taurus, but most of it's new. There's actually a 3D image of a land train like this, and that's the image I sent to Nick to kind of give him a direction for this. So that's a land train, long vehicle. The Mac, the Martian Spinner, and then this giant thing called the Mobile Armor Strongpoint. Back when Amethyst was getting made, back in the homebrew days in the early 2000s, obviously I didn't have any original art, so I got inspired. I took a bunch of art from a bunch of artists. I asked their permission, which is something very few people do. In fact, when I made requests and say, hey, I'm doing this homebrew campaign, can I have permission to use some of your artwork? All of them, but one, I can't remember the one who said no, but all of them said yes. Yeah, sure, go ahead. With most of them saying, thank you for asking. No one ever asks. Most people just take them. Some of them were actually so intrigued by the setting, they wanted to do additional new illustrations. And I went out and reached out to them when Amethyst got legit and went professional. And some of those artists are still working with me today. And one of them was Nick. So a lot of Amethyst, especially going to Revelations, I'll mention a lot is inspired by another illustration. And so you're like, this city was just based off of this illustration. And yeah, because back in 2003, 2004, I had permission to use that illustration for the game. And so this location, this vehicle was based off of this illustration. And now we went legit. I mean, there's a couple options. I got to try to secure the rights to that illustration, but most of the time that wouldn't work. It would make the graphical style inconsistent. It was much easier just to say, hey, Nick, this is what the original image was based on. Create your own interpretation of that. And he's already been doing it. Max from the first book, for example, is heavily inspired by a similar illustration. And so there's a couple examples that we've been doing it all this time. And the mobile armor strongpoint is another example. I thought the scale was a bit off, so I added this guy myself, right? This little guy right here, just so you can see how big this thing really is. It is a building on wheels. We get into aircraft. There's a lot more rules in aircraft because we've introduced something called Ethereum. Ethereum, also known as Skywrite. So the whole thing is that Motigo, this city here, they went and figured out how to cause matter to act inverse to gravity. So instead of being pulled toward gravity, it gets pushed away. And if they mix 50% of one matter, 50% of Skywrite, you create something that is gravitationally neutral. And at that point, you've basically mastered anti-gravity. Not only that, you've mastered anti-gravity without needing technology and power to sustain itself. And that basically created this massive watershed event where suddenly anyone could create anti-gravity technology. Motigo, however, kept it very secret. They wouldn't let people know. They eventually did meet up with Porto. That's a bit of a mistake there. Got to get that deleted. They met up with Porto, and they had a trade agreement. And Porto gave Motigo robotics. Motigo didn't have much to offer. Porto wanted anti-gravity. Motigo didn't want to give it to him. Porto kind of used their connections to get it anyway. Motigo got really pissed at this and then cut ties with Porto. But it doesn't matter. Porto got it, and they learned from it. They built their own anti-gravity, and now they're more advanced than Motigo. So that's the reason why we have so many flying vehicles, because of something called Ethereum. You'll see examples of it. This is another illustration that was heavily inspired by another illustration that was I had permission to use for the Amethyst, and you'll see it again actually in just the next page. So this is a Citadel. There's like dozens of different variations of Citadels. This is just one of them. There's our Gravity Cruiser from Porto, and then the Stratton, which are these city-sized colossal architectures that they look like brutalist statues. If you want to know the illustration that inspired this, I think if you go to Wikipedia and look up anti-gravity, I think the illustration that I had permission to use is actually there. So this is an interpretation of that image. Porto City ships. Oops, sorry. That's a Porto City ship, like 600-700 meters long. The Porto Sky Galleon. Nick insists, like, I was trying to ask Nick if he had seen the movie The Creator, because there's a hovercraft that looks like it has this little thing. He said he hasn't seen it, so it's kind of a cool coincidence, but this is a Sky Galleon. I do not have an image for a Beluga Carryall. It's just a plane anyway. The Montego Sky Spheres, there's actually like 5 different Sky Spheres, but I only threw in the one here. So that's the Montego Sky Sphere. And then we have the drift vehicles. Drift vehicles are vehicles, they're basically boats designed to run in the sand sea. And there's a bunch of different variations we had. Kind of traditional sand vehicle, a bit of a kind of a solar punky variation, and then a military one. This one's kind of inspired from Homeworld Deserts of Carrick. And then we have the submarine. And then, so people, you can totally buy these. And you can even modify them. You can have power sources that, there's one called EDF drive. There's something called a chronocartograph, which allows you to navigate the whole thing. There's a whole sub-campaign in this desert. And now we're moving into the setting. Chapter 7, L'Europa. This is Europe. This is everything basically up until Eastern Europe, just past Ukraine. Because there's actually a wall called the Barrier Range that divides the continent in half. East of that is Cacodemania and Dracontia. No, Dracontia is north. Cacodemania and Ixandar. Sorry, I wanted to say that. Cacodemania and Ixandar. Anyway, so we have a couple bastions. We talked about Montego. And this was, once again, there's a really cool image that provided the inspiration for this variation. Once again, zealotry, religious theocracy and so forth. Porto, that's the ultra high-tech utopian city, and that's it. We only have 2 bastions in L'Europa because there's too much EDF. Going into Echinations, Akoya with their big wall. This is their big wall. Almanac, which is in the UK. Alto Douro, which is Spain. Now, you can see on the map here, Porto is this bastion. They claim this region called P3, and that's kind of what they're claiming. So technically the bastion is all of this, but it's really just this city. There's even some fantasy towns in it, like Tartarus, or is it Tartus? Alto Douro is it's kind of an ungoverned but still civilized, non-chaotic kind of commonwealth, but they rely on Porto for protection. Porto basically licensed technology to basically maintain security. There's not a lot of magic, but it's not part of the bastion, and this is one of their policing vehicles. It's kind of a security droid. I don't have any rules on that. Maybe I could have, but maybe if I wanted to add a few more pages, I would throw in the Porto defense droid. I don't know. Maybe I will. I got 4 days. I could squeeze it in. Maybe be a stupid thing for me to do. So yes, that's Porto, little defense robot, and over top of the vineyard. So that was kind of cool. Ashahale. We talked about Ashahale because that's the image on the contents. You can see that image now without anything on top of it. Kingdom of Dragons. Buildings built by dragons, so everything's higher scale. Barblos, which was trying to be a bastion, but magical disruption was simply too high, so it turned into Barblos. And we have a bunch of stuff on them. Crystal Forest, which leads into Damasia, and Damasia is the Damascus city. There's a Crystal Forest, and then Dracontia is on the other side. And there's Damasia illustration. Eldengard Evergreen. Ishivia, which are forested areas. Floating Room of Piotr Radzek. Here's a funny story. So one of the illustrations from the original 2000 homebrew version of Amethyst was a floating rock with a geodesic dome on it. and it was one of the inspirations for a region. And the illustrator was named Piotr Radzik. And so I emailed Piotr and said, hey, I'm doing this campaign. Can I use your art? And he says, like, sure, go ahead. That's no problem. Thank you for asking. But when I got to designing the guy who lives in it, I just thought Piotr Radzik was a cool name. So I said, hey, can I use your name? He's like, that sounds awesome. I'm a lich. Freaking cool. So it's the floating around Piotr Radzik, and Radzik's been mentioned a couple times because in the lore, he went to Canem and killed Karos Rifts and took one of his artifacts back with him, and then he lives in this floating keep, which he has been locked inside of ever since. But yeah, this is a variation of this image that Piotr Radzik. I don't think I spelled the name exactly the same way, but that was his name, Piotr Radzik, and that's still same thing with. There was another illustration, and the illustrator was named Osvaldo Caraballoso, and I thought that name was so awesome. Same thing. The dragon boats, I think, were inspired by him. And he also was just like, it was kind of cool that his name was added to the lore. And so, yeah, Osvaldo Caraballoso is a real guy who's an artist. So I kind of play homage to some of the artists that inspired Amethyst by putting them into the lore. We have Nick. I even asked him why the unicorn's horn is a little crooked, and he thought he did that intentionally. Gabathak's still too bad. I don't have an illustration from Gabathak's a corrupt, evil church. There's Hapura, we mentioned before. Same with Mayasto. Innisfahale, which is very, very, very fantasy Ireland. The only thing that's technological is the half ring, which is a bunch of grind towers, but everywhere else is heavily magic. Very few humans, lots of anathema. The changelings live here, and I was having fun with the names. Inish, Bellawon the Bay, Braid of Kronk and Castletown. My favorite one though is this one: Mourn area of still outstanding natural beauty. You think that's a stupid name? Mourn area of still outstanding natural beauty. That's a real place. You can go to the maps. It actually exists, but they call it the Mourn area of outstanding natural beauty. So as a joke, I called it the Mourn area of still outstanding natural beauty. And that's me being a little tongue-in-cheek. Kirjath Sefer. There are lots of magical schools, but there's only one magical university, and that's Kirjath Sefer, where all the greatest wizards go to learn their craft. And there's Luminaria, which is this gigantic kingdom of the Volars. Very classical fantasy, but very Slavically inspired. So a lot of like onion towers and stuff like that, but very traditional fantasy. Some information on them. Humanity never could build a bridge connecting Africa and Europe. So the dwarfs did it. Monolith is a failed bastion that has ruins. There's another one that's even more prominent. Monolith, a smaller version that's just overgrown. We talked about the Meyer Castle. This is these egotistical, fanatical paladins. Pannonia, which is Greece. Quorum, which is this gigantic they are technological, but they're as technologically advanced as you can get without disruption. So they're heavy on TL0. They're not really steampunk, but they've pushed the industry as far as they can get without technological breakdown. So that's Quorum, very advanced. Talk about them. CFS Rova, which is I think it's in the ruins of Venice and the area around it, and the Sea Elves have claimed it as their own. Tunnels of Serenos, which I mentioned, which is the Tenenbree area. There's a bit of a mistake. This illustration is supposed to be here. You're going to see it repeated, and the repetition is not supposed to be there. I got to delete that. Some of these bastions are based off of potentially real locations. Autostat, for example, is I think it's a German auto manufacturer's headquarters. And I think CERN is in here as well. And then we move on to Arconia. And there's Arconia. You can see how big the Bastion of Harmony is, because it actually you can see it from space, basically. And you can see how big the Drift is. The Drift is gigantic. It's its own, basically, campaign world within Amethyst. And then we have Assembly. And we talk heavily about biocarbon, the creatures, the genetic abominations that come out of it, and all of that. There's a lot of lore you can read up on it. A lot of lore. Harmony. Nick was saying this is one of the hardest images he's ever had to do. It really shows the detail. It's really awesome. And Harmony is one of the biggest bastions. It's also one of the most low-tech. And Polis. I don't have an illustration for Polis. We could never make an illustration that worked. But it's a 3-tiered city. I took the idea of her middle and upper class to a literal truth. So the lower class lives underground. The middle class lives on the ground. Upper class lives on top. And so they're the only ones that get to see the real sun. Rongo is a bastion that failed. Now, we've talked about bastions that have failed before. Canos, Barbalos, we just mentioned. Most of the time, they get to tech level 0, 1. They try to make it work, and then disruption's too high, and they fall back and become a fantasy kingdom. In the case, there is one in South Florida that got to about TL3, and then they got destroyed by Baruch Melkut. But most often, most of them either they stay at Tekken atolls and they don't get big enough. Rongo is the one weird exception. Rongo it got very large, got very powerful, and then something happened and the whole thing collapsed. There's no one living in Rongo except for self-repairing automatons. No one knows why. There's a story that a whole bunch of immigrants escaped from some calamity, made it to Harmony, and they've been there ever since. And people go to Rongo to tap the natural resources, to grab technology to salvage, but it's very dangerous because almost all of the automatons are hostile, and it's a huge bastion. If at its peak, it would have been the second largest bastion on the planet after Harmony. But nobody knows what happened to it. Some rumors that there's something involving time. And there's a lot of, I love a lot of weird lore where things are weird and creepy and not explained. So we actually have a lot of lore regarding Rongo. But there's no one from Rongo, so there's no paths, and that's why we didn't see any of their technology outside of their machines. Going into the fantasy version of Arconia, Al-Kalyan, which is a kind of a fantasy kingdom based just off North African culture. Bitter Sea, Persian Gulf. The Drift, once again, Drift is so big, it almost gets its own section. So this is like a sub-chapter start in the Drift. This colossal sand sea, there's information about their unique cultures, their unique religion. The peoples are all different, and they all run off different variations of the same vehicles that can run across the sand. Here's the interesting thing. This is a full disclosure. So Nick drew almost all of this. He drew all of this. I have the sketch around here, but this is all him. And he drew it up to about this point. And I really like the idea of doing a 2-page spread. But when I moved it, this was in the middle of the image, and I wanted it to be on its own page. So we talked about it, and I said, hey, well, how about we try using one of those image extenders? Now, most of the time, people use them for photographs, like zooming out of a photograph and extrapolating what could be outside. But instead, we took Nick's image, put it here, and told the machine, I'm not sure what program it was, to simply examine this and extrapolate what it thinks the rest of the image would look like. So someone says, hey, this is technically has 20% generative content, and technically that's true because this, I think from here to here is generated, and then all of this is Nick. Like I said, my conscience is clean on this one. I think like it's it. This is entirely Nick's image. All we did was extend it digitally with this. And like I said, unless I pointed it out and said, yeah, there's a line right here, you wouldn't notice. But yeah, this is wonderful image on the Drift. And we have a couple more we show off. And yeah, we go into heavy detail in the Drift. A lot of stuff. This is another funny example. So there are these two places, Plinth and Cenotaph. And this was, once again, back in the day when I was playing around because I was fascinated with the idea of generative AI before the controversy really got really massive. And I walked away from it. And I was trying to create one of these city ships from Porto, and I was trying to get it to be just a handful of feet off the ground, just hovering a few feet. I didn't want it in space. And being the AI being really quite primitive at the time, merged the ship with the ground and created this little pindle of rock and put the ship on it. And I said, well, that's cool. And so I thought the idea that the towns in the drift, because of the sand, they have to find little pieces of rock and then build their society away from it. And so that's what plinth is. And obviously you don't see an image of plinth because it was a generative image and we don't do that here. But then cenotaph came out, and that was a similar idea that we used instead. And we added in the grass on top of it. The idea was just this kind of Tekken oasis in the sand. That's kind of cool. And there's that image. That's not supposed to be there. Okay. So I got to probably screw up this thing as I try to remove that image. Harmony exclusion zone. We have Kagani. Kagani is kind of a lawless area, but it could be considered a bastion, except none of the Tekken atolls have united. So there's a bunch of small Tekken enclaves. Then we have Mirage. That should be on the other page. And Mirage is similar, but it's mostly fantasy areas. So there's some Tekken. No, there's some grind towers, and some of the most well-known areas for Amethyst, including Scarecrow, the Sky Tower of Dromos. So we've mentioned these two at length before. The Scarecrow is an idea that pops up. It pops up in Affinity as well, but it was always part of Amethyst. This weird statue overlooking a town, and there was an image that was inspiration for this, and it took a while. We finally got to a point where Nick got to draw his own version of it, so I was really happy he got to do that. Siltara is in Egypt, and then we get to Tanagir. So Tanagir is South Africa, and there's a giant wall that basically cuts it off entirely. There's a geographical feature in South Africa. I can't remember. It's like a ridge of mountains and plateaus. And this wall basically conforms to that area. And Tanagir, people think it's a bastion, but there's no technology or any geographical features that would indicate it's a bastion outside of the wall. And there are these massive machines. They think they're machines called Tananim, that roam around the inside, and they seem to be able to, reproduce and self-repair. And so there are rumors that it was either a bastion that failed, and it failed in a spectacularly weird way, or it was some type of weird fantasy laboratory operated by some group or some person, because they also found out how to do these things called mechanites from learning from the Tananim. And the mechanites look like machines, but they're actually fantasy creatures. And the whole idea is that you have this type of creature, and when it's placed inside of a exoskeleton, it will basically grow into that exoskeleton. So imagine if you could grow the inside of a lobster, but you gave it another body, it would grow into that exoskeleton and become that exoskeleton. So that's a mechanite, and we'll see them later. The mechanites were developed by another kingdom, and they've used that knowledge to exploit the land around them. Trinitas is a fantasy religious kingdom similar to Abadan in Kanem, except this one is more Muslim based. It's called Trinitas because it supports the three Abrahamic religions. There are some people who are religious that are definitely going to be offended by what's spoken in this. I felt important to present the story this way. And like I said, I imagine there's going to be a few people. Like I said, there's always been some religious allegories in Amethyst, and this is me being a lot more brutally upfront about it. And we'll get past them, big section there. Veld, which is a savanna where the Chaparrans live, and then the Valithi Wilds and Zabalaza. Zabalaza is the kingdom that's using these mechanites in order to exploit the wilds. So the wild is just being exploited, it's being strip mined and deforested because of this kingdom's push. And you can see the Tanagir wall. Maybe that's the reason why I didn't include the image, because you can see it right here. but that's the Tanager. And then Zephyrion, which is this green kingdom that borders the drift. And we have an image of them. And now we go into chapter 9, Angels Fall. Now, this is the big spoiler. This is the big revelation. We know this image here has been part of Amethyst since the beginning. We explained who he was, and his name was Kairos, but we didn't explain where he came from. We'll finally explain where he came from and who his people are. And it is a big one, folks. There's a lot of content, a lot of revelations, things that you didn't know. All of it is here. This is going to open the setting like... Originally, this was chapter 5, by the way, in the same place where the Saints were in Factions. And the editor said, push us to the back. It's too big a spoiler to have it in the player section. It should be in the GM section. So we moved it. What are they? Well, I don't know if I should tell you guys if you guys are players and you want to discover what this setting is. So I'm going to leave it for now, but you can play as them. They are presented as a playable character if you want to, but I'll leave that to the GM to decide. But they look obviously very robotic. They are not. They're human. And you'll have to read the details as to why. They also have their own vehicles and their own weapons. And you can also upgrade them with cybernetics. Chapter 10, Monsters. This is a friend of mine. And like all my friends, they eventually find their way in my illustrations. So some of these are, not much is new. Like these are all monsters that if you read the book, you knew was coming. We have angel monsters. We have elemental dragons. We referenced these dragons before, the fact that they're these massive elemental dragons in the setting. And they're huge. Like they are bigger than any dragons that you've seen in 5e D&D. There's a great scale, and you can see one of the drift vehicles here, and then there's the sand dragon emerging from it. Though this is Seraphix and Terrakion, there's Sulfurinth the Invisible, and then Uzu of the Rock, which is an illustration from Factions, which reveals that this was in fact a dragon. It was a dragon all this time. You just didn't see it. There's its head. Anathema, we have changelings. We got some monsters from Vispids, Runeros. We actually show some of the Petramorphs, which are these golems. There originally was like 4 of them, but I only had the one illustration that I got from Nick, so the effigy is in there, the lobster is in there, and the other 2, unfortunately, were cut. Drift monsters, and the whole idea with Nick is that we took sea creatures and made them into desert creatures. So dust devils are that's a dust devil, and he's riding a duneback, and duneback is a dolphin. And then we have the Dune Slicer and the Goridipus. You can kind of see where we're going with this. The Magrine Nomad, both get people. The Sandmaw. Yes, I'm using that other half of the illustration from the drift, but because you can't see a Sandmaw, it's hiding underneath the sand. There's a really goofy horror movie called The Beach, or The Sand. I'm not sure what the hell it's called. But the whole idea, these people are trapped on a beach, and if they touch the sand will grab them and pull them into the ground and eat them. That's the whole movie. And so these people were just basically trapped, and they couldn't get down onto the sand because then they would instantly die. And I thought that would fit with the setting, so I made that creature. It's called the Sandmaw. And then the Sovereign. I don't have an image of the Sovereign. Sovereign it's a sand whale, but we didn't have the time for the illustration for that one. Meyer Paladin, some Volaris. Here's Piotr Radzik. The Rongo Automata. I talked about Rongo and the self-repairing. There's one that repairs them. There's a type that repairs all the others called the Bob unit. And the whole idea that there are rewards. So if you actually go into Rongo and hunt these things down, there are rewards you can get from them. So you can say salvaging, you get gold and rare earth metals and stuff. So that it's kind of a risk reward. It's almost like a loot and shoot setting. There's a Tommy and Betty, which we don't have illustrations, and then the Alex, and then we have the Andy, and then we have the Hero. And the Hero is the only one that's self-aware and conscious, and that's why it has an alignment, neutral good, and everything else is unaligned. Then we have monster versions of all the super heavies. So Escudo, Conquistador, Fafnir, Gorgon Gravdancer, Yogamander, Panzer, Paluda, and Tiamat. And then we finally get to Gebermak. That is Gebermak. Gebermak is a monster that's been talked about, has been referenced. Obviously, we've had an illustration of it since day one. And we finally have the stats. And obviously, he is very powerful. Stage 1, because there is another stage that's more powerful than that. And then the Tenenem, which we talked about earlier, these colossal self-repairing but degrading machines in this region. We originally had like 5 of them, and we only had 2 illustrations, so there's 3 of them. And yeah, once again, we don't have an illustration for the Sky Leviathan. That's too bad. But you can tell that they're very much inspired by Shadow of the Colossus. There's definitely some inspiration there. And then we have the Mechanites, which I talked about, which are these organic things living in pre-built exoskeletons. And so there's a few of those. We have the Adzi, the Guggamug. That's a spelling mistake. It's not supposed to be an I there. And then the Clud and the Stallo. Right, there we go. And then our index. And there's 2 bits of lore here which tease the final Amethyst book. So there you go. We are just over an hour. Look, I did that. I managed to cut it down for a full 2 hours into 1. There we go. And that is Amethyst Revelations. All 436 pages of it. Kind of insane. Biggest book we've had. So I'm going to make a few more changes, and this is going hopefully online this week. And if you're a backer of Amethyst, yeah, you'll be most of you will be receiving this PDF, and this, well, the fixed version of this is going to go to China at the end of the week, so we can start printing, so we can finish up this Kickstarter. It's been a long journey, folks, and I appreciate all your help. So I'll leave it at that. This has been Chris from Deus Ex Machina.